Hello, I'm Rhonda Stevenson, and welcome to Space Matters. Today, our topic is space policy. Please help me welcome my three guests, Ms. Laura Forzik, who is the owner of space consulting firm Astrolytica, which specializes in space science, industry, and policy, and is offering space career coaching services. Also, Dr. Greg Autry, who is the clinical professor of space leadership, business, and policy in the Thunderbird School of Global Business at Arizona State University, and Mr. Jim Muncy, who is an advocate of commercial space. He is the principal of Polispace, an independent space policy consultancy, and a former congressional and White House staff member. I hope you enjoy this episode. It is a lively conversation. Hi, I'm Rhonda Stevenson, and welcome to Space Matters. Thank you for joining us today. We're speaking about space policy, and I have three wonderful guests, Jim Muncy, Laura Forzik, and Dr. Greg Autry. If you would, starting with Laura, would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Thanks for having me on. My name is Laura Forzik, and I'm with Astrolytical, which is a space consulting firm. And my background is in astronomy, astrophysics, and planetary science. So I come at this from a science background. I shifted from pure science to sort of the business aspect when I worked on International Space Station commercialization and payload facilitation, which was a lot of fun. And that opened me up to the whole world of how to do awesome things on space station and who might actually do things on space station. And then from there, I got picked up to sort of work on a space startup that was doing all sorts of things with suborbital transportation, point-to-point transportation. Unfortunately, in the world of startups, not all of them make it, and this one did not. And so then I started my own company, Astrolytical, and we do space science, space industry, and space policy analysis, and a little bit of career consulting as well. And so one of the things that I really push is that space is open to anyone, and anyone can be involved in space. And along those lines, I wanted to capture what my generation, the millennial generation, thinks about space and the space industry, what motivated them and where they want to go. So I put out a book last year called Rise of the Space Age Millennials, and I'm actually about to publish a second edition taking into account Generation Z perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to that. I've also been working on a book on space tourism and private spaceflight. I've interviewed quite a number of flown astronauts and future flyers on their perspectives of what surprised them about spaceflight and how they're preparing. So look forward to that, hopefully by the end of this year. And I'm glad to be on this panel.
Thank you for being here. Dr. Autry?
Hi, I'm Greg Autry. I am a clinical professor of space leadership, business, and policy at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. I've been studying the commercial space industry in a research context for about 20 years. Before that, I was a serial entrepreneur with a focus on computing and networking and application development in the enterprise. I served on the NASA Agency Review Team in 2016 and as White House liaison at NASA in 2017. And thank you for including me here.
We're glad to have you. And Jim Muncy, tell us about you.
Hey, so I've been working in space policy for 4 decades now. Spent most of my first 20 years in or near government. And for the last 20 years, I've been consulting for the commercial space industry, helping them deal with the intersection of politics and policy and law and economics and business issues with the government, and helping them try to get to the business goal that they have, but having them get through the wickets that government sets up in the way for them. So, Wernher von Braun liked to joke that we could lick gravity, but the paperwork was overwhelming. Well, that's part of what I deal with. So,
well, welcome all of you. It's just a pleasure to have you all here talking together. I guess the first question is, what is space policy and why does it matter? And how does it affect and impact our ability to expedite our progress into space? Laura, would you like to go first?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to give a definition of this, because to me, space policy bridges between the very tiny little minutia of all the regulations on a local and federal and international level, and also the grander scheme of things of what do we prioritize, and what do we fund, and how do we fund it, and everything in between. And so it bridges into law and diplomacy and communication. And so these two gentlemen will likely have a better definition. But to me, it seems to be a multidisciplinary area where we can get things done.
I think that's a great definition. I think it partly depends on what you're talking about when you say space. If you're thinking of space as a government program carried out in the United States by NASA, by other agencies and other nations, then you'll have one concept of what space policy is. But if you see space as a frontier in which average people can seek and pursue opportunities for learning, for creating economic activity and wealth and prosperity, then, or just to learn, just for out of sheer curiosity's sake, then you'll have a different sense of what space policy is. And I come from the latter school. I think that space is for everyone. It's about everyone. It needs to include everyone. And therefore, space policy, correctly understood, is how does the human species want to expand into space? And that question of how and why are really the fundamental questions of space policy to me.
I guess I'd have to say, what is ocean policy, right? So that doesn't exist because most people realize that's too broad of a context to really put into one bucket, right? That would include maritime trade policy. It would include naval military policy and geopolitics and what the National Science Foundation does with scientific biology investigations that involve porpoises. It's really broad. And I think eventually we probably won't refer to space policy as a single thing, but as Laura alluded to, it's everything from the macrocosm to the microcosm. So launch regulations at the Department of Transportation and budgets for NASA, planetary exploration, cooperation between our space agency and other space agencies. It's a very broad topic we've got here to cover in an hour.
In polling the audience, I did have one question, and that is discussing space policy or making plans for space policy putting the cart before the horse? Aren't we a bit premature in the discussion? We have not returned to the moon as of yet. So why is it so important to have these conversations discussed?
Policy should actually, when well done, precede action, because otherwise action occurs without policy, and that means you don't know what it's going to be. It's unpredictable. And when you go and you attempt to constrain something that actors are already doing, for instance, in the private and commercial sector, after the fact, there's going to be a lot more pushback than there would be before the fact. So, no, it's super important to do that right, and particularly when you discuss going back to the moon. We've got an outer space treaty signed back in the 1960s by the U.S. and most other nations that we have to adhere to. It makes the United States government essentially the insurer of last resort and responsible party for the actions of anybody associated with the United States in space and in particular on a celestial body. There are complications there that you don't want to just find out what they are by letting random events occur. You definitely want a coherent policy to make sure that happens. And most commercial actors want policy. They want to understand what the regulatory environment is. They don't want no regulation because that's chaos. And they certainly don't want undefined regulation that may come in the future. That's even worse. They want light regulation that they understand. Other people may choose to put them under more restrictive regulation, but whatever it is you're going to do, doing it up front's a lot better than doing it later.
You also want to look at the big picture. And so if you are one country interacting in space, which is inherently global, and maybe in a way we'll think of it as multiplanetary in the future, you want to be on the same page. You want to have the right kind of space policy that everyone agrees upon, at least in some form or another, so that there's no misunderstandings, so that no one is misinterpreting innocent actions or overreacting to maybe not so innocent actions. You also want to understand the ethics involved. So if you have a private actor who is taking people into space, let's say to the moon, what are they allowed to do to those people? What are those people's rights? And so there's ethical concerns there as well. So you want to understand without having to overly restrict the actions of companies, but you want to understand how they can operate in a safe and ethical framework. And so there's a lot going on that we need to discuss before these things take place, ideally, as Greg said, because you want to have the basic instructions laid out, and it'll get more complicated as we start doing it. And so why not start talking about now the things that we're planning to do, so we can at least think about what's going to happen, if we're landing on the moon and that interferes with somebody else's moon base, all these things that are hypothetical now that are going to become reality quickly. So we should talk about it now and get all on the same page as much as possible.
Yeah, these aren't just like sort of law school moot court questions. These are questions that, again, at first, at a broad level, we need to understand why we're going, why we want people to be able to go. The most important part of the Outer Space Treaty is that everyone has a right to explore and use space. And not only nations have a right to explore and use space, but their citizens and their juridical entities, their companies, their nonprofit organizations, individuals. Everyone has a right to go out into space. Space is the province of all mankind. So the policy issues have to say, well, how are we going to make it possible for everyone to go? How are we going to make it, legally and in terms of overall structure and organization? How do we enable people to go? As much as how do we restrict people from going? So the questions are very important, because if we want to be able to become multiplanetary, as Laura said, we need to think about, well, how do we structure it so that it's a natural evolution and a natural bubbling of free peoples out into the solar system?
So how does space policy and the implementation of space policy enable and expedite the development of space industry and private industry outside of NASA and outside of the military and outside of government contracting?
I think
Well,
it
a
does
good example. I'm sorry. The good example would be the history of the commercial space launch industry. Back in 1981, 40 years ago, a small company based in Texas was trying to get permission to launch a private rocket, and they would be the first private company to launch a rocket all the way into space, over 100 kilometers, and then eventually to launch a satellite into orbit. At that point, no U.S. company had the right to do that. No one had ever gotten permission from the government, and there was no one part of the government you had to get permission from. They ended up consulting with over 40 different federal and state agencies, all of which had to say not no. Okay. And in all saying not no, they got an effective answer of yes, that they could in fact launch their payload. 3 years later, the Congress passed the Commercial Space Launch Act, which intentionally set up a regime under which U.S. individuals could, by showing that they were not going to harm the general public or the property of the general public or violate international treaties or harm U.S. national security, they would presumptively have the right to risk their own money and possibly their own life launching a rocket into space. And that is an incredibly affirmative, positive thing that enabled, as long as you weren't doing anything really bad, you got to go risk your own money and your own life, trying to do something that's really hard to do. And it's taken arguably, it took 30 years for the industry to really get underway at the levels that we wanted it to. But we're now faced with the blessing of multiple new launch vehicles entering the marketplace. And they won't all survive, but they are rapidly lowering the cost of access to space. And that makes it possible for more people with more different ideas of things they could do in space to try out their ideas, because it's cheaper to go do something there.
If I might say, like I noted, it's incredibly important you have a defined regulatory environment. The investment community in particular doesn't want to invest in an industry that doesn't have that. And so, as Jim pointed, the establishment of that going back to the 1980s is really important. And it manifests in the US very clearly as not only a boom in our commercial space sector, but countries from around the world investing in our companies and moving their companies into the US, which is really unusual. You see companies from New Zealand or the UK, for instance, companies from the UK like Virgin, whose money comes from the Middle East, companies whose money comes from Ukraine or Russia, trying to put factories to do manufacturing in the United States at a time when basically every other industry has been moving their factory out of the United States to somewhere else where they find the regulatory environment for that industry to be more conducive to their manufacturing. So it really comes out well. The other thing, though, that's important if you want to enable an industry or economic development or access to a territory is to use the government as an anchor customer. And there's huge historical precedents for that, going back to the transcontinental railroads, where the government stepped up and subsidized the construction of those, understanding that it would have commercial value in the future, but that it had immediate applications for government needs at that time. The transcontinental telegraph, and then the air industry by helping establish the network of airports, communications, and standards across the country was super important. The national highway system was established, which allowed us to have the trucking industry we have today. You could go on, but the government has had a role in establishing these industries by being an anchor customer and putting in fundamental infrastructure, and then stepping back and handing it off to industry, the internet being the most significant recent development of that.
Defining what okay to do and what is not okay to do is also really important. So, for example, property rights in space. This is an area of contention with the Outer Space Treaty. It's written somewhat vaguely. The Outer Space Treaty is signed on by the United States and many other space powers, most of the space powers, in fact, and it is sort of vague as to how property rights exist. You can't claim sovereignty of a celestial body, but can a private company dig up lunar regolith, for example? Regolith is just dust or dirt. So lunar dirt, if you dig that up, can a private company own that? And so there's a space policy issue right now in question. And the United States and Luxembourg and Japan and a few other countries have sort of sided on, yes, you absolutely can own this privately and sell it. And in fact, NASA has established this sort of bid out there where I think it's 3 companies have said that they are going to go to the moon and they're going to mine some kind of body of just like a very small pile of lunar dirt, lunar regolith, and sell it to NASA. One company wants to sell it for $1 just to prove that that fits within the space policy framework existing within the Outer Space Treaty and subsequent signed treaties. The Moon Treaty is not signed by the United States, for example. And that is astonishing because it's not just US companies. This is open to the entire world. So one company is Japanese, I believe. And so it's really kind of amazing that space policy within the United States can kind of shift the direction of companies all over the world who want to operate in space. And what do they do with this pile of dirt? Well, they don't have to do anything. NASA doesn't have to do anything with it, but future companies want to sell it or use it for propulsion, for creating roads or landing pads or buildings. There's so many different methods of using what's there. It's called in situ resource utilization. It's just using what's already there. So it could be lunar dirt, it could be Martian dirt, it could be asteroids. You know, there's endless possibilities. It starts with the space policy here in the United States and elsewhere.
Yeah, I would note regarding the Moon Treaty, not only has the United States not signed it, but basically no spacefaring nation has signed on to that. Australia is the only significant signatory to that, and they're smart enough to think about getting out of it. It was a very poorly considered treaty, and I am proud that one of the first things I did as a space policy advocate as a high school student was join the L5 Society to prevent the U.S. from signing on to the Moon Treaty, which that organization did convince the U.S. Senate to back down from that. So not all agreements or regulations are a good choice. In any case, you do need to figure out at some point whether people are allowed to extract and resell resources. If they're not, you can pretty well shut space down, in my opinion, because it'll be nothing except a government funded activity in a time of declining discretionary budgets. If you really want to see the benefits of space for humankind, you've got to make it so that investors who put money in can actually see a return from their investment. And if people develop value added real property, they're eventually going to need to sell that real property and capture the value they added to it, which is a step beyond just saying that you own the resources. The other big problem with the Outer Space Treaty is this fact that you can't claim sovereign territory is lovely from a kind of kumbaya benefit of all humankind standpoint, but it means nobody's in charge, right? So if two private actors come head to head, it is absolutely not clear what government could go in and enforce whatever law exists, whether that's international law or domestic law. I think that there's a big problem not having sovereignty, whereas if a specific area is U.S. or a specific area is Chinese or belongs to the Lunar Federation or whomever, then there's at least an organization who has set rules and is capable of kinetically enforcing them should that be necessary. In the absence of sovereignty, you have the Wild West and other uncontrolled frontiers, which we've seen in the past how that works out, and the answer is generally not well.
So taking into account these factors, one of the questions that I've had to field more than once is, why are we discussing space policy now when we can't even enforce it? So how do we enforce space policy, and how does that have some sort of accountability? So who would like to take that question first?
I don't think that's true. The United States is responsible to the other signatories of the Outer Space Treaty for anything that a U.S. citizen does in space. So they can come to the United States and say, okay, so-and-so, stepped on my moon base and got it all dirty, and that won't work anymore, and you have to fix this, or you have to pay me, or something like that. Now, we haven't worked out all the details of customary international law in space in terms of how that will be done, but the framework for responsibility of determining whether there's damage, and if in particular was there fault? In other words, were you responsible for the damage you caused, or because in space the legal regime is fault based. It's not an absolute regime. We are very important that we protect everyone on the ground, or on flying in the air. Everyone who's on Earth is protected from activities in space, because they are not participating in those activities in space. But if you go into space, you are taking the risk of, and great expense of conducting activities in space. And if somebody's satellite bumps into your satellite, the question is, well, were they being negligent in allowing that to happen? And if there's negligence, then you might have some claim against them. And again, we haven't figured all this out yet, but at least we have a basic framework in place where the nations can be the nation state that is the launching. It's typically called the launching state of the country of the spacecraft or satellite that's launched. They are responsible to the Outer Space Treaty other signatories. So you can't just fly into space and say, I'm flying with a flag of Nowheresville if you launched from Cape Canaveral. you're a U.S. company and you conducted the launch in the United States on a U.S. launch vehicle, and for all intents and purposes, you are to be treated as a U.S. venture, and you are accountable to the U.S. government for making sure you don't violate the Outer Space Treaty, including interfering with other people utilizing space.
Yeah, I agree with Jim. I think that's not true at all, that we do definitely have space policy in effect every day domestically. You can see the FAA, the FCC, NOAA, there's all kinds of federal bodies within the United States that regulate what companies and private actors can do in space. And then internationally, we've got agreements like on the International Space Station. We've got norms of behavior and who's responsible for what and who pays for what and what we do together. The Artemis Accords is a great example of future international cooperation, where we have set, we being the United States, the State Department and NASA have set norms of behavior and had several countries sign on. It's actually a multilateral agreement. It was initially bilateral, now it's multilateral. And we're seeing these countries come together to say that we are going to have space policy like this, and defining how they're going to abide by it. I don't know what happens if they don't abide by it. I don't know if that's discussed much, but at least they're coming together to say, yes, we're going to rally around these particular areas where we all agree on space policy.
I do think that we might have a moment of concern where there actually could be misbehavior and it could be difficult to enforce. And it's not on launch, like Jim said. You're not going to put a rocket at Cape Canaveral and have a big U.S. company spend $100 million and pretend that they're not American. But that said, as we see up to hundreds of small satellites launched on a single rocket these days, and thousands per year, we're definitely getting to the point where non-state actors are the dominant operators of on-orbit technology. And eventually you could have things that are launched that are not what you thought they were. In the past, that wasn't an issue. If Lockheed built a satellite and ULA launched it, you could pretty well be sure that the United States government knew what it did, and it did what they thought it did, because those actors were too dependent on their relationships with the U.S. government not to adhere by those rules. A couple of years ago, well, we did have some satellites launched on an Indian rocket by a California-based startup that had been denied their permitting by the U.S. FCC, but launched anyway. It wasn't clear what due diligence was necessarily done on the Indian side or the payload integrator side to see what those things did. But I do think that there aren't a lot of people looking really closely at that CubeSat to decide whether it does exactly what it says it does. And we need to be thinking about that, because there are certainly non-state actors with malicious intentions who we should be aware of.
That's the perfect lead into the next question. So do we think that China and Russia will sign on to future Western norms of space behavior as they relate to policy, and set general rules and align with them? And if not, what might be the outcomes for them? Pro, cons, specifically to non-governmental investment within their own economies, and also regarding economic relationships with other actors.
I'll take a crack at this. I think the Russians are a unique situation in that they used to be a truly dominant space player, and now they're just not. And while they had some interesting experiments with commercial space activities 20 years ago, they're now pretty much run by the government. Their industrial entities are pretty much under the control of the government again. And they will come along when enough nations have joined the Artemis Accords that it becomes a fait accompli, and it's easier for them to just swallow their pride and join up, and probably demand some inconsequential changes to it for them to agree. But they'll come in. China's a different matter. China has commercial space activity going on with what I would argue, although I'm not the expert on this show, pretty much private activity, mostly private activity. But then there's also so-called commercial activity in China that really is controlled by the government and in particular by the investment arms of the Chinese Red Army. So I think that they would prefer to have an alternative regime that is more realpolitik based, and you could see them and Iran and North Korea and possibly Russia and some others try to hold out for a fairly long time with some alternative means, while labeling the Artemis Accords as being too American-centric and too Western and too capitalist. So I just don't know. What I know is you got to start somewhere. And it was very important to the United States to show the world that we were not just going to be responsible as a governmental player in space, but that our private companies that were playing a leading role in space in our nation and really for the world were going to play by the rules. And we were going to establish what those rules were going to be, at least at a principle level. And we were going to negotiate those principles with other nations. And we, as a result, it was not a top-down, the U.S. Decided what would be in the Artemis Accords. They did it interactively, talking to several other nations, and then decided, said, well, here's our first draft. What do you think? What would you change? And they had those conversations, and now they have signatories to the initial agreements. And I assume that they will be organic living documents and that they may change as new nations join. But the idea that nations will stand up and say, we agree to be bound by our treaty obligations. We will take responsibility for monitoring our own nation's private companies because we all want the economic benefits of space to redound to our citizens. So we want our private companies out there doing things beyond what the government can afford to do itself. And we want those economic benefits to flow to our people. And we want the international trade to benefit people around the world. So we want to have this commercial legal regime in place in space.
Did anyone else have a comment on that?
Sorry, Greg, I'll let you talk in a moment, but I'm just going to disagree slightly with Jim in that I think that it's very clear that Russia is going to join with China. They're heading in that direction. And so I see actually two distinct areas of international norms forming. The Western norms led by the United States and followed by its allies, and the for lack of a better term, Eastern, led by China. And who they bring along, I'm not sure. They also have lots of allies that sort of are both allies of the United States and of China. And so it's not clear yet how those two different entities are going to differ in how they pursue space policy. There's a lot of similarities. There's more similarities than differences, but there are significant differences. And so I'm definitely seeing in the short term anyway, that there will be two distinct areas of space policy forming. And the United States, for one, is going to lead a significant portion of the world, but will not be able to carry the entire world. I'm hoping in the long term, this is my idealism speaking, I'm hoping in the long term we can all come together as one planet. But I don't know what timeline that is on and if that's too idealistic, because we're all human and therefore there's always going to be conflicts. And so we can hope that space can bring us together globally as one planet as we go farther out. But realistically, there's still geopolitics and there's still conflicts. And I've yet to see exactly how this is going to play out, because I don't think anyone truly knows what's going to happen.
I might add to that regarding the question of behaviors, how people will comply with rules that they might agree to and what their motivations are. China in particular wants continued access to Western capital and Western markets. So for them to go off into this axis of evil with Iran and North Korea and create this space empire isn't going to be very productive for them. And I think there's going to be a lot of posturing in that way, and they're going to do governmental space perhaps in that way. But I do think that they're likely to enter into international agreements that allow them to have continued access to capital markets and to customers in the West. That said, their history of the current Chinese government would suggest that they don't honor treaties that they sign on to, and that they are very good at drawing big red lines like in the South China Sea around vast amounts of territory and arbitrarily deciding that those are Chinese, and then when convenient, taking atolls or islands from other countries and building artificial structures and expanding those islands with massive environmental degradation, and then saying we're not going to militarize these and agreeing specifically with the US not to do that, and then proceeding to fill those up with missiles and planes. So it's going to be a difficult situation for the United States to deal with a China that's nodding its head and saying, yes, 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 we agree to these terms, at least in commercial markets, and want access to your capital and markets, but with the expectation that their behavior probably won't match their words. And we've been trying for 40 years to fix that problem, and unfortunately, it's been a consistent problem.
I do think that there may be some strange benefit to this competition, in that very much as John Kennedy saw space as a frontier for showing that the United States system and capitalism was better than the Soviet system. We may find that how we go into space will, set an important mark down to the people of the world about how we are, as we go into this new frontier, how we are being more responsible, more conscious, more ethical, more generous about our quote exploits or exploitation of space, perhaps than we were in the New World. But and China will, and the system that they adopt or the rules they adopt, again, we're both bound by the same outer space treaty. So overall, the frameworks are supposed to be relatively consistent with that same overarching treaty. We will see. The Russians have been after us on the issue of space weapons for years, with, of course, them defining the space shuttle as a weapon and not defining satellites that go up next to and blow up next to our satellites as weapons. So, I hope that we'll have a good test of the alternative worldviews, and that people around the world will be able to see, well, I'm going to work with the Chinese on this, and I'm going to work with the Americans on this. The one thing I think would be very stupid is for either of us, well, certainly for the U.S. side or the Western side or the Democratic side, to be exclusionary or protectionist about it. We shouldn't hold working with the Chinese against anyone. If they want to work with China and work within the Chinese system and they find benefit from that, that's fine. We should aim to show that we are a better partner and our approach to space is better over the long run for the most people, and attempt to be utilitarian about it and try to produce results for the people of the world.
I'm going to take that one step further. Not only should we not be exclusionary about it, but we should also think about reconsidering how we partner with China in space, which right now is not at all, except in very, very, very limited circumstances. And so there is an amendment that's been in place for several years now called the Wolf Amendment, which heavily restricts how the United States, specifically NASA, can work with China directly. And so there's a lot of roundabout ways to go about working with China. You can be a commercial company, work with China, you can go through a third party, multilateral. I mean, there's just there's reasons why this was put in place, but it hasn't worked. And so what we're seeing then is China develop independently a lot of the capabilities that the Wolf Amendment was trying to prevent them from developing. And so there are great areas where we can partner scientifically, for example, that would be a benefit to both parties, to the world as a whole, I'd argue, for example, with the Mars missions that are going on right now. And so I don't think that we should hold it against other countries for partnering with China. I think that we should consider partnering with China more, especially in a scientific realm, not necessarily on the technology or anything that might be double use, anything like that. And I understand all the different complications of working with China's government. However, I think that there are areas where we can start to partner, just like we did under the Soviet Union, partnering with NASA on the space station, Soyuz, International Space Station partnerships that have worked out, at least worked out to this point in a limited fashion. We don't have to necessarily agree with everything a country does, but it can benefit both parties to work together, especially when science doesn't know borders. Science is borderless. And so it makes sense in a way to continue to work to open up space policy in that realm.
Yeah, I have to respond to that if I might. First of all, I'd be clear that the International Space Station wasn't done with the Soviets. It was done with a temporary, free and democratic Russia that we saw emerging post-Soviet under the Yeltsin regime, which quickly collapsed into the current Putin regime. I don't think we probably would have made the agreement we made on ISS if we'd had to make it with Putin. And I can't say that having made that agreement has necessarily resulted in great benefit to the U.S. or any liberalization in the Russian regime. That said, it's been functionally practical, and the astronauts have had fantastic relationships, and science has benefited, as you noted. And I strongly agree that I don't see any problem with the exchange of scientific data. I would say that the Wolf Amendment has been very effective at actually preventing the transfer of technologies. China was determined to develop those things. The fact they had to develop them on their own meant that they've gone fairly slow instead of fairly quick, whereas in many other industries, they simply grabbed the U.S. technology and took the industry over to China and wiped out the U.S. players, examples being, the solar energy field and a variety of tech field where the U.S. taxpayer funded the development of those technologies, and then we just handed it to the Chinese so that it could, improve the lives of their workers rather than ours.
So in closing today, and I know that Dr. Autry has a hard stop coming up, what is the most near-term concern for space policy that helps to enable the development of private industry?
I don't know if this completely answers your question, but for me, there are two really near-term areas where we need to focus. One being space debris, space situational awareness. However, there's so many different ways to look at it, but making sure, one, we know how to track everything that's up there, all the satellites, all the pieces of debris, the dead boosters from rockets, everything that's up there needs to be able to be tracked as accurately as we can. And there's a lot of issues as to how to track these things accurately when they're tumbling and all of that. And two, what to do about it, how to get rid of it, how to deorbit it or service it or sweep it up. And there's policy involved in this in a lot of different ways, because when you're talking about launching an asset, that asset still belongs to the launching country or the launching countries, I think. So there's a lot of ways that you can look at it. Is there a way to partner with countries to bring these things down safely, or to recycle them or reuse them? Do we need to amend international space policy so that somebody can go up there and get rid of this. We need to make sure we don't create more. And so that means deorbiting things maybe more efficiently. We have guidelines right now that are widely not abided by at all about how often, or I should say how long these things stay in place. And also blowing things up on purpose. So we've got anti-satellite ASAT tests, and the kinetic ones are real issues, because the kinetic ones means that there's actual impact and lots of debris there. And that happened just a couple of years ago with India. Now the United States has done this, China has done this, but India has most recently done it. And they tried to make it so that the debris stayed under a certain orbit so that it would deorbit quickly, but they weren't 100% successful. So I'd say that is the immediate problem, because that affects everybody, all players, government, commercial, no matter who you are, that will affect you. Having debris means that we cannot use the space. Literally, we can't, we have issues launching, we have issues sending up satellites. We have all kinds of plans to use that space, and we can't use it if it's getting cluttered. Number two, lost my train of thought, but I think it was, International Space Station. That's been fantastic, right? It's getting older. There are starting to be leaks. The funding is going to run out eventually. The United States is going to renew it probably at least until 2030. But we need to plan for a future without the International Space Station. China is launching this year, and to go with what Greg was talking about, I no way am a fan of the Chinese government's atrocities, but China is launching their own space station this year, and they already have international partners. So if the United States wants to continue to operate in space with humans, at least, we need to think of ways that we can incentivize commercial companies. And that means giving NASA the funding, and NASA convincing government that they need the funding to support commercial space stations, because NASA is not building International Space Station 2.0. So if we want to keep utilizing that space in that destination, I should say, or have multiple destinations, even better, then we need to plan now, because ISS is not going to last forever. And these things take a long time to plan and build and launch up there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that point of functional commercial space stations. I think everybody understands that. I'm excited to say that at least one company, Axiom Space, looks like they're seriously moving along, and they're going to have a port on the ISS, which was a good decision made by NASA. Be a good idea to get the so-called free flyer station going as well. And on space debris, you're totally right. And that's an area where we can work with the Chinese. There's a mutual practical benefit from making sure there isn't any more and getting rid of what there is. One thing I want to say on that, though, is there's a lot of talk about let's tax space launches or satellite operators of large constellations and make them pay for space debris. SpaceX wasn't the company that created the space debris, okay? The space debris is there because of government actions over the last 50 plus years, primarily from the United States, China, and Russia, and notably the Chinese 2007 ASAT test, which was completely irresponsible activity that created this vast cloud of space. Putting the burden of dealing with that mess on private companies who are being very, very responsible. So if you look at Starlink, for instance, those satellites deorbit. They're in very, very low orbits where they're going to come down on their own, even if the deorbit mechanism should fail for some reason. Our private companies like ULA and SpaceX make sure their second stages don't stay up there, which is not the case with other governmental actors. This is primarily a governmental problem. The government should fund the cleanup of space debris if that becomes technically possible, and not put that burden off on the private sector. Providing a clean and functional infrastructure for businesses to operate is a government role, and we do not want to stop in our tracks and burden a nascent industry with a tax to deal with a problem government caused.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on the space debris and space situational awareness topic. Because it opens up into a broader topic, which is what we want to do to ensure that it is possible for more companies and more universities and even schools to launch satellites and do things. Is what we want to do is put in place a lot of rules, okay? Or is what we want to put in place a regime where it is in your own interest to participate and cooperate and share information about the location of your satellites with the government and with other people, so that everyone can optimize their own space activities and not interfere with each other. We want to have what I would argue is a promotional regime rather than a very tightly narrow, rigid regulatory regime. And I think the Department of Commerce is the perfect organization to do that. They made a tremendous amount of progress on that in the last administration. And I'm hoping that the new administration quickly appoints a new director of the Office of Space Commerce at the Department of Commerce, and frankly raises that office up to the Office of the Secretary so they can play a leading role for the whole U.S. government in promoting commercial space activity. NASA has a role as a customer. The Department of Transportation has a role as a regulator, but Commerce has a role as a promoter as well as a regulator of commercial space. And I hope that they will be able to play that leading role in the next few years. Watch your screens. We'll see whether the Department of Commerce steps up and continues to play that leading role they did under Wilbur Ross over the last 4 years.
Well, thank you. Thank you to each and every one of you for your time today. This was a very insightful conversation, and I hope that we continue to have more in the future. And thank you to everyone who joined us for Space Matters today.
Thank you so much. It was fun.
Thank you.
Well, that was an interesting conversation. I hope that you all learned something. I hope that we were able to create a picture that gave you greater insight into why space policy matters and some of the considerations and factors that are involved with private industry space development, as well as considerations for operating as a global effort so that we can become a permanent spacefaring civilization, which is my priority. Thank you to all of my guests. And there's one more announcement that I wanted to tell you about. Please join us next week. We have a very heartfelt and exciting visit with, I'm not going to tell you, but please do join us.